Good morning. Welcome to, I have notes, the adult education class today, January 18th, 2026, and we're at the Fourth Presbyterian Church here in Chicago. My name is Jude Kelly, and I'm on the Adult Education Council. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Carey Cranston. He's president of the one and only American Writers Museum that's also here in Chicago. He will be speaking to us today about the museum's quite fascinating new temporary exhibit. It's interactive and it's titled American Prophets, Writers, Religion, and Culture. It opened this past November. Before we get started, I'd like to look ahead for a moment to the next quite exciting adult education event. It's in 3 consecutive classes beginning next Sunday, January 25th. It's an exploration of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Becoming Christ for Others. And it's presented by professor and author Andrew DeCourt, PhD, of the University of Chicago. Now, back to today. Please note we are live streaming this class on YouTube. So you may want to keep that in mind as you participate in the class. To tell you a little bit about Carey, he's been president of the American Writers Museum for about 10 years. Prior to that, he served for 12 years as president of Fox College, a private career college in Chicago. And prior to that, he was in public relations, most recently as vice president of Hill and Knowlton, a global PR firm. Early in his career, he taught writing at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and DePaul University. He earned a BA in English from DePaul, summa cum laude, a MA in English from the University of Illinois at Chicago, a MS in Library and Information Scientists from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. He's lived in Chicago his entire life and in the Beverly neighborhood for the past 23 years with his wife Ellen and his 2 now grown children. I would like to offer a prayer. May we pray. Dear God, we thank you for this time together to explore the mystery and grace of your presence in religions and cultures as interpreted by American prophets. May we awaken every day to the ongoing miraculous creation that is our universe, with gratitude, respect, and compassion for all who share the gift of being. Amen. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Carey Cranston.
Good morning, everybody. We all doing okay? All right. You were sitting for an hour. Now I'm going to make you sit for another hour, but hopefully I'll try and keep you from falling asleep. I'm going to ask a quick question. How many of you have ever been to the American Writers Museum? Oh, that's a nice grouping. I'll take that. All of you who have not, shame on you. Just kidding. We would like to see you come visit in the near future. And perhaps what I'm talking about today will be something that will draw your attention. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about the museum. I know some of you have been there, but a number of you have not. The museum is at 180 North Michigan Avenue, so not far from here at all, just across the river. And it is a fun, interactive space that celebrates the significance of American writers on our history and our culture. It does that through interactive exhibits. We're not a collecting institution. So you guys have the Newberry right around the corner here if you want to see some really cool books and some old things. That's what they're about. We're about engaging people in conversation around the significance of writing in all its forms and how it's been such an important aspect of our culture. So we do that with, things that you touch and turn, touch screens, typewriters, all kinds of fun things. We also, along with our with our exhibits, have a lot of programming. So if you do live downtown or are close enough, you want to come visit, we have regular programming that you can find on our website. Usually at least once or twice a month. We have authors in, we have academics in, we have conversations around all kinds of topics. This is an example of an evening program. Sometimes we do them out of house. We partner with Chicago Public Library and other institutions in town. This is when Justice Sotomayor was here for a program we put together with Chicago Public Library. And that was a really fun night because we got to bring a busload of kids in. There were a bunch of kids there, but we brought one busload that got to meet her in a little room off to the side and ask her questions. And it was during the confirmation hearings of Brett Kavanaugh. So it was really interesting because the kids asked some pointed questions and got some interesting responses, which I will not repeat online. But we also now every other year, so this year, 2026, on June 7th, we will have our third American Writers Festival. And that will be June 7th. It's a Sunday. It goes from 11 until 5, and it will be at Harold Washington. There will be 6 stages, programming all day long, probably somewhere between 75 and 100 different writers on panel discussions and individual conversations. So it should be a really fun time. I know for certain that Bill Curtis will be there to talk about his memoir. So if anybody's a Bill Curtis fan, if you're from Chicago, come on out and see Bill. But there will be a lot of other things. We do all kinds of fun events along with our programming, our author programming. We have something once a month called Get Lit, which is what it sounds like. It is meant to come and have drinks and engage with the exhibits, but also there's usually an activity. There are scavenger hunts, there are trivia events. We do all kinds of fun things that get people engaged. We've done mystery parties with a murder mystery happening in the museum. So there's a different theme every month, so if you check it out on our website, it's something fun to come do with you, family, friends, whatever. I think February's program is something about romance. We've sometimes said down with romance, but I know it's not that this time. I think it's about rom-coms, but I digress. So come out for any and everything that we do. Another aspect about what we do that's a big part of the institution is our educational programming. So we have curriculum from elementary through high school. We see college classes coming in on a regular basis as well, but my education team focuses on that elementary through high school. We have funding to bring in low-income schools to not only make it free for them, but to pay for their buses to get them downtown. The kids find the space very engaging and interactive, and we get and drive them into the content. And so it's a lot of fun. It's a great way for us to reach people. We now have a national student writing competition that's reaching kids across the country. We have online curriculum for teachers to download across the country. So we service schools from Connecticut to California, pretty much. So we are an institution that is focused not only on exhibits that help us celebrate the past and programming that helps us promote the future, but also very much on inspiring the future writers of tomorrow. So that's what we do as an institution as a whole. Part of that entails sometimes putting together special exhibits. So we have a chunk of the museum that is permanent in how it's set up and how it operates, but then we have a couple of spaces that we change out every year or so. And past exhibits can range from things like Bob Dylan and songwriting, which we did when he had won the Nobel, to topics like Level Up, which was a recent exhibit around gaming and writing. So we were looking at the people who write things for role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons to modern video games. And if you're wondering why that's significant, because most young people today and most even middle-aged people today get their narrative storytelling from video games. The video game industry in the United States is in the world is something like $200 billion. And Hollywood is a little circle here, and the publishing industry is a much smaller circle, and the music industry is a much smaller circle. People are online playing games, and those games have very interesting stories to them, and now there are people who focus only on writing those stories. So that was why we were looking at that topic. We've looked at other things like My America, Immigrant and Refugee Writers Today, which was an exhibit that was a multimedia exhibit. We went around and interviewed authors all across the country and asked them the same 12 questions. They were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants, and they answered questions that were thematic, like, what does it mean to be an American? What does family mean to you? And that were more writing focused, obviously, about how does having multiple languages affect your ability to be a writer? How do you look at the narratives that you write about in relationship to other people in the past history? And so there's a lot of different things. And we actually created so much of that content that we were able to put all of it online and create an online website called My America. And that exists today, that people can still visit, see all those responses from 30 plus writers to 10 different questions. And we have curriculum for that as well that is centered around middle schools. Is an 8-week curriculum that teachers can download and use around the country. We had a lot of programming aimed for that. That exhibit was not timed well. It came out in 2019 at the end of the year. Believe it or not, in 2020, something happened that kept people from coming in to see it. And which is part of the reason that it went so well online. But we started with some really wonderful programming. This is one of the authors who was in the exhibit. She came out and did a program with a bunch of kids. We were able to give them all copies of the book. So we love being able to do things like that when we can. Another more recent exhibit was called Dark Testament, A Century of Black Writers on Justice. We do not, as I said, have artifacts per se, but we will borrow artifacts and we will also create things. So in this instance, we were looking at a century of black writers from the end of the Civil War through the Civil Rights era, looking at some of the most important figures and then looking at the themes that tied them together and how they were relevant today. There were some multimedia aspects, but one of the things we were able to do was engage with Chicago artists to create original works of art, portraits of 16 of the most important writers that were identified by the advisory group. And then we had some augmented reality and other elements to the paintings. And we've now been able to make this our first touring exhibit. So it's been to Vanderbilt University, and we're talking to some other museums, and it will continue to be on the road for the next couple of years. Now, that leads me to our next, or our newest, new exhibit, which is called American Prophets. Now, people might say, why are you talking about religion? We're not supposed to talk about those things. But we do. We're looking at it because it's an important topic. There was a great opportunity for us to follow. You're going to find that this is not the only exhibit in Chicago on this topic over the next couple of years. There's an organization called the Lilly Endowment out of Indianapolis that promotes every few years institutions through grants, which we were able to get one of, to pursue the topic in relationship to their institution and its mission. So they ask cultural institutions to embrace the topic from a non-denominational and inclusive point of view and non-proselytizing. So the Chicago Architecture Center has one of these grants. The National Museum of Mexican Art has one of these grants. Their exhibit's opening in April. The Newberry Library has one of these grants. Their exhibit may open this April as well. I can't remember the exact date, but you will see more and more information on this topic as the next year and a half go through, because I think there are 6 institutions in total in Chicago that will be exploring it. We just happened to do it first, because we're better than everybody else. No, I'm just kidding. Because we are a small institution and we move rather quickly. And the timing was such that we said, well, we need to end this other exhibit and we'll bring this one to the front. So I'm going to start with why it's relevant. A lot of people know, obviously, we're at church and you all go to church here, so I understand that. But we know that in our society, in American society, there has been a relative drop-off in how many people associate with a given religion. The Pew Research study comes out every year, and does a big survey every 10 years that looks at, how do people associate with religion, what denominations, et cetera. And so we know that there has been a big decline in people associating with Christian religions, from 20 years ago, it was 78%. Before that, it was probably up in the 80s and 90% area, and it has dropped down to about 62%. Religiously unaffiliated has grown up to almost 30%. And some of the other religions have grown from like 5 to 7. So what does that mean? Well, it's interesting because there are other elements to that survey. It is a giant survey. And one of the things that is in that survey are 4 questions. And the 4 questions are, do people have a soul or a spirit? Is there a God or a universal spirit? Is there something beyond the natural world? Is there an afterlife? And when you ask these questions, the answers are 86, 83, 79, 70%. But on a net level, so in other words, if everybody surveyed, if you ask how many of them said yes to any one of these 4 questions, the answer is 92%. So 92% of Americans have some spiritual aspect to their belief systems internally. So where do they get that from? Where does it come from? They say they're unaffiliated or less connected, but they're still carrying with them ideas that come from different religious backgrounds. And that made us want to explore how this topic relates to American culture and how American writers are involved in it. Just as a little background, when we are a small institution, so people sometimes say, well, who wrote this? And sometimes people will walk up to the poor young people who work at my front desk and say, well, why isn't this book here? And that's not their job. Why didn't we include this author? Partly because we have 11,000 square feet. Believe it or not, that is not enough room for every author who ever wrote a book. And on top of that, it's, so that's not their job. But we don't have a big curatorial team. I have one person who's 100% dedicated to content. And the way that the entire museum was put together initially, and the way that we do all of these special exhibits, is through groups of specialized advisors. So when the museum was first put together, we had 45 subject matter experts and 7 content leaders who helped us determine what might be covered, what types of ideas should go into it, and the exhibit design firm helped us come up with ways to make it engaging. And so that was a big part of who we are, and so we've kept that. So every time we do these special exhibits, we pull together teams of people to help advise us on what are some of the big themes we should be talking about, how should we pull this together, and give us direction on things and people that we can focus on. And so in this instance, we got lucky. Dr. Emily Cruz is in the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, as is Dr. Sarah Hammerschlag. Janan Mohir works at an organization called Interfaith America. Kathleen Falslani is a former Tribune reporter with the Religion Beat, who's written a number of books on religion and popular culture. And the rest of these folks are all experts in different areas of literature and or religion. So we were able to pull this team together with the help specifically of Emily and Sarah, who were very gracious to take the lead on the project with us. So that's how we address, we've got a big topic, we need to get into it, how can we make that work? Now, some people will ask, why do you call it American prophets? Are you saying the writers are prophets? Yes and no. We're saying they are prophets with a lowercase p is probably the way to look at it. There's a lot of definition of the word prophet. I give you one of the things that struck us is this quote from Isaac Bashevis Singer from his Nobel speech when he got the Nobel in Literature, long before Bob Dylan. And he said, in their despair, a number of those who no longer have confidence in the leadership of our society look up to the writer, the master of words. They hope against hope that the man of talent and sensitivity can perhaps rescue civilization, and that maybe there is a spark of the prophet in the artist after all. He goes on to say, I'm not ashamed to admit that I belong to those who fantasize that literature is capable of bringing new horizons, new perspectives, philosophical, religious, aesthetical, and even social. And in the history of old Jewish literature, there was never any basic difference between the poet and the prophet. So from there, we took this idea of American prophets as the writers are people who have their own religious background, who are surrounded by religion and influenced by it, no matter what their personal belief systems may be, and that inevitably what they write about is influenced by these forces and therefore reaches out to the readers and influences them. So they're prophetic in their ability to communicate with others and to bring ideas forward. Very often in our culture, it is through writers that we learn about other faiths and other religions. I give the example when I talk about this of my understanding of Islam did not exist, a young man from Chicago area, when I was young, until I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. So, there's a book that you go to pick up and you don't know necessarily what it's about. It doesn't say, oh, this is going to tell you about one man's journey from one religious background to another and another. And that spiritual journey is essential to his story. So that was my exposure to that. And so often this is how people get exposed to religions they don't know about, and start to understand different people's perspectives. So that was important to us. The other thing that was important to us was recognizing that it isn't always the writing we think about. It isn't always the book that is very much a religious, spiritual journey that may influence people, or where we see the reflection of people's religious background or belief systems coming through. So before we opened this exhibit in November, we actually started programming for it last April. So you may have missed some of these programs, and I'm sorry if you did, but they included programs way back in April with some of the biggest names in science fiction writing, and we talked about making new gods, because in science fiction literature it is very common to explore the idea of religion, sometimes through fantasized or created religions that are, of course, reflective of religious traditions that the writers may see going on around them. So we had N.K. Jemisin, Nnedi Okorafor, talking about that topic. We had a program with Dave Barry, who had written a biography, an autobiography called Class Clown that just came out last year. And the interesting thing about Dave Barry in that book is the fact that he talks in the beginning about his father, the Presbyterian minister. And how that affected him. And then we've had academics like Paul Ely. We've also did a really fun program at the down the street at the Fine Arts Center with Peter Sagal and 3 other comedy writers, and they talked about faith and humor. They talked about what it takes to write comedy and how they might be influenced. And as Peter pointed out, we had a Jew, a Catholic, a Hindu, and a Muslim on stage to talk about comedy, and so it sounded like the beginning of a joke, and it was actually a very serious conversation with some good laughs. We've done programs on divine love and the idea of romance writing and how religion can come up in that. We've done some programs on specific authors like James Baldwin. We did one on horror writing and religion at the University of Chicago in their divinity school. We've talked about Native Americans and other groups. We had one on spirituality and song from a journalist named Alan Light, who writes about rock and roll. So we've had a lot of really great programs, and if you're interested in any of them, they are on our YouTube page. So if you want to go to YouTube and look up the American Writers Museum, all of our programming is there, and there is a playlist for the American Prophets programming. And we have more coming. So, pardon me. This Thursday, we will have Marianne Ahern from Channel 5 News coming to talk about religion and journalism. A lot of the conversation will be about popes. She has covered a number of papacies. She has covered the Chicago Archdiocese here in Chicago for many years and is very interested in the topic. And so we're going to talk about how journalism talks about religion and specifically her experiences in that world. We have a couple of online programs because it's January, and I'm very grateful that there's as many of you in this room as there is today with the cold weather outside. But a lot of times we don't do in person. Marianne Ahern will be in person, but we've got one on women and suffragettes and women's rights and religion. We have another one coming up again on Audre Lorde and James Baldwin. And we have a program coming out in March, and that is actually about, it's called Assembling Religion, and it has a lot to do with Henry Ford and religion. How the idea of taking the model of the factory was then pushed forward toward the church, and his religious background and how it was influenced. So that's some of the programming that we have coming up, some of the programming we've done. We hope you might want to come out and see some of it. If you've never been to our museum, and I know this is going to tell you a whole lot beyond the fact that it's not gigantic, it's about 11,000 square feet. We're on the second floor at 180 North Michigan. But this particular exhibit is spread across the museum. So we have two changing spaces, and we filled them up with different elements to this exhibit, but we also spread some pieces around through the rest of the exhibit, including our children's gallery, because we had so many opportunities with this. There's a film when you first walk up to the exhibit that actually kind of explains this idea I've talked to you about American prophets, but it does it equating the writers to a bunch of motorcycle gang riders. I know it seems silly, but it's kind of fun. The exhibit itself in the main Meyer Gallery is split into two elements. We do borrow pieces, as I said, when we sometimes put exhibits together. And in this instance, we were very interested in having some pieces from writers that might reflect their own religious background through an artifact, and then how that may reflect in their work. So we were actually, we had a couple in mind and didn't know how many we would get, and then we found that everybody we reached out to said yes. So we found that really fun, and that was sort of why there's more exhibit pieces than would fit in the room. And there are some in our Reader's Hall and some in the Children's Gallery. But I'll give you a couple of examples of things that we borrowed from people. So Samira Ahmed is a professor at the University of Chicago, and she's also a very successful young adult author. She is Muslim, and I know you can't see it in that little picture there, but in that artifact is a small amulet. It was given to her by her grandmother. It is inscribed on the outside, it's metal. Inside of it is a small piece of paper rolled up with a Muslim prayer of protection. So her grandmother gave her that. She wore it most of her life. She said she feels a little weird right now because it's hanging in the museum. But she actually factored it into as an element in some of her fiction. So that's that example of her upbringing, her grandmother influencing her then taking that and making it part of the adventure stories of her characters. And then another example is Louis Perez. So I'm going to ask, you're a crowd that may remember a band named Los Lobos. Anybody? Okay, a few of you know who Los Lobos are. They're still playing. They are 73 years old, at least Louis is. And they've been playing together for over 50 years. But they were very, very big in the 80s. And they had a really big Grammy-nominated album called Kiku. And there's a song on there called The Saint Behind the Glass. And if you're familiar at all in Mexican culture, there is something called the Santo Niño de Atocha. And the Santo Niño de Atocha is a small shrine with a statue inside of it of a young Jesus. And there are mythologies around it about the Santo Niño going out at night and doing good deeds, and people keep them in their home and they put little things inside of the shrine. So this particular shrine was the one that sat on the dresser in the one-room house in East LA where Louis grew up. It was his mom's, and it was her mother's before her. So it came from Mexico. It existed in East LA. He wrote a song called The Saint Behind the Glass, and so he has loaned that to us so that we can see that connection between his background, his parentage. It's not necessarily reflective of his personal belief systems today, but it is influential on who he is, and it led to a song that talks about this piece. Another example is these are the vestments of Pauli Murray. I'm going to ask how many of you know who Pauli Murray is, and you don't have to feel bad if you don't. But I'm going to encourage you to make some efforts after today to go learn more about Pauli Murray. I'll give you the basic primer. partly because she was a center point. I said we had an exhibit called Dark Testament, A Century of Black Writers on Justice. It was about a whole lot of writers. Pauli was one of them, and that title, Dark Testament, is the title of one of her most influential poems. So she was a poet, but she was a lot more than a poet. She was a poet. She wanted to be a poet. She became an activist. She was born in 1910. In the 30s, she sent scathing letters to lots of people, sometimes to get into universities that wouldn't let her in. One time to FDR to tell him that the New Deal was not helping African Americans at all and what was wrong with it. Eleanor read that letter and invited her to the White House, and they became lifelong friends. So the thing that happened was, as an activist, so this is her on a freight train being a hobo going around the country, and she was giving speeches. She's already graduated from one college at this point, trying to decide what to do with others. And Thurgood Marshall hears her speak and talks to her and says, "Will you please come to Howard University Law School?" So she does. So she goes to Howard University Law School and studies law, graduates top of her class. The top graduate at Howard at that point is supposed to go to Harvard for a one-year fellowship every year. Now, the problem wasn't that she was black, because obviously they take kids from Howard every year. It was that she was a woman. Now, Harvard now has a library named after her, so it's okay. She did get her, I think, her master's from Berkeley, her PhD from somewhere else. She continued in the law. The important thing, though, is that while she was there, she became a civil rights lawyer. But while she was even a student, the underpinnings of her arguments are the underpinnings of Brown v. Board of Education. They are the underpinnings of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's arguments for women's rights at the Supreme Court. They are the underpinnings of the rights for trans people in America in the case in 2015. Her legal writing is writing that changed this country. She's one of the 3 founding members of the National Organization of Women. She was eventually a professor of law. She had a long career in the law. She wrote an autobiography. She wrote a history of her family. She's the daughter of enslavers and enslaved. And so she took that family history and wrote about that. She wrote about her own life. She hid from the world that she was gay for her life, and potentially trans herself. She wrote in her diaries about her struggles with her identity. Yet through all of that, she did all of these things. And then one of the things that held her together her whole life was her faith. So she went back, got her doctorate in divinity after all of that, and became the first black female Episcopal priest in the U.S. So that's Pauli Murray. She was arrested for not going to the back of a bus in 1940. So she was not necessarily remembered by history, or she may have been forcefully forgotten. She has not been as forgotten of late. And if you ever want to get a chance, read her poetry, read some of the other things that she wrote. Just last year, a book of her sermons came out as a hardcover book. So her vestments are in this exhibit. So I give you that as an example of someone whose faith was always underpinning what they were doing. And I'll give you a couple of other different examples. I mentioned we look at things, so that hallway has all these cool artifacts on one side, and then on the other side are these little bays with interactives that help you take dives into different ideas. So we look at song, we look at comedy, we look at science fiction, we look at poetry, we look at memoir and novels and the theme of journey. So in each of those bays you can dig deep into all kinds of different works that give us examples. So there's a screen that lets you take a deep dive into comedy. There's lots of little clips from TV shows and movies and other elements. And we have a double example. We also have an artifact from Harold Ramis. So you can find Harold Ramis and the movie Groundhog Day on the screen. And then you can find out in the Reader's Hall this pamphlet. So Harold Ramis was born, obviously, here in the Chicagoland area in the northern suburbs. He was Jewish, and his family was Jewish. But he got interested in Buddhism for a couple of different reasons, and he actually wrote down the general tenets of Buddhism as he saw them. He called it the 5 Minutes Buddhist. And he typed it up on a piece of paper, folded it over like a Chinese menu, laminated it, and would give them to people. And he would say, oh, well, this is, here, take a look at this. So one of our advisors had one of those and loaned it to us, and so that's there. We also printed up copies if people want to take it with them. But people don't realize, how many of you have seen the movie Groundhog Day? Fair amount, right? It's a fun movie, it's funny. Do you think about the religious implications of the film? Some of you are nodding yes, some of you no. Well, it was a big deal when it came out. There was an original screenwriter. Harold didn't write it from scratch. He adapted a screenplay. That screenwriter was Buddhist. Harold had his own interests in Buddhism. So there is a deep underpinning of Buddhist thought potentially within it. But there was an even more interesting reaction. So I'm going to play a little video clip for you. And this is Harold talking about the reaction to the film.
It's a metaphor for a lot of things, which was brought home to me when the movie opened. My producing partner, Trevor Albert, called me on Sunday. The movie opened on a Friday. On Sunday, he called me and said, there are pickets outside the theater in Santa Monica. And I said, what are they protesting? He said, they're not protesting. They're Hasidic Jews walking around with signs that say, are you living the same day over and over again? And then, called the Chabad, I guess. So then I started getting, almost immediately, my mother-in-law lived for 35 years in a Zen Buddhist meditation center to the end of her life. And I called her right away on the weekend, and she said they saw it. The abbots and the senior monks, she said they loved it. They thought it expresses a fundamental Buddhist concept. And then I heard from people in the yoga community that it was everything that they were about. And then I started getting letters from the Christian, from Catholic priests and Christian and Baptist ministers saying this totally expresses our philosophy. You must be Christians, obviously, because it's such a devoutly Christian movie. And then the psychiatric community chimed in and said, obviously, the movie is a metaphor for psychoanalysis because we revisit the same stories over and over. We keep reliving these same patterns in our life, and the whole goal of psychoanalysis is to break those pattern behaviors. So I thought, well, that's an ecumenical response to this film. It's got something.
You can see, this is something we don't think about. This was a movie that was a funny film, right? It's just a laugh. It's just a lark. But these are the things that are underneath so many of the things that are written. And this is why it was an important topic to explore, because we can't talk about writing in American culture if we don't also talk about religion. And of course, not everyone's belief system is one that is fundamentally around a religion that has a deity or has a belief in that type of idea. So while we have different writers who are Muslim and Hindu and Christian and Jewish and all kinds of things, there are also people who have their own belief systems that are not from that. And so an example would be Kurt Vonnegut. And Vonnegut was a humanist, right? His parents came here. His great-grandfather founded the Freethinkers Society of Indianapolis, and he was named the honorary president. And if you read Cat's Cradle, Cat's Cradle is very much about the idea of what do we believe in and why do we believe in it. So the idea of the Cat's Cradle is that you've got this kids game that is either where you look inside of it and you see a cat in a cradle because you believe, or you look inside of it and just see a bunch of string. And that everything is wrapped around that idea of what we're willing to believe and for why. He described humanists, and he in his semi-autobiographical novel Timequake, he said humanists try to behave decently and honorably without any expectation of rewards or punishments in an afterlife. The creator of the universe has been to us unknowable so far. we serve as well as we can the highest abstraction of which we have some understanding, which is our community. So this is where somebody like Vonnegut is coming from. There's still the issue of how do we react to the world and how do we make sense of it, and trying to frame that in what might seem like a less religious stance, but is also one that is exploratory of how we think and feel about each other. I mentioned also song. And so in this exhibit, there is a jukebox. It does work. You can press a button and hear a song. There's a menu on the table, and the menu on the table shows us the songs you can pick from, what's the religious underpinning of the songwriter and the instance of this particular song, and it runs from Chance the Rapper to Aretha Franklin and a whole bunch of other people, Kurt Cobain. And so it looks at popular music and asks these questions. And the example I put up here is an interesting one because if you know the song from Carole King, who was Jewish, that's called You Have a Friend. You know, and I will read some of the lyrics because if I sing them, you'll all be sorry. And it would be an awful thing to do to Carole King. But, you know, it's when you're down and troubled and you need some love and care and nothing is going right. Close your eyes and think of me, and soon I will be there. And it goes on, you know, to brighten up even your darkest night. You just call out my name, and you know wherever I am, I'll come a-running. So this is a very famous song. It was very popular. It's also been covered by a lot of different artists. So an example of that is Aretha Franklin. So Carole King saw herself as a very secular songwriter, not someone who is writing from her religious background. She was Jewish, but she wasn't really thinking about it that way when she was writing this song. But the interpretation by a different artist can change the meaning entirely. A lot of people see that friend as a religious figure, potentially God, potentially something. And Aretha saw it, and in her album Medley, when she covered it, she actually combined it with a gospel song. So suddenly that friend is very clearly no longer your best friend on the other side of the country who you're calling because things are bad. This is very much a spiritual power. And she brings her voice and her belief systems into her interpretation of the song. So it means that not only does the writer have influences set upon them, but the readers are now bringing their set of beliefs to how they interpret the work. So it is a constant cycle of how these things affect our communities, affect who we are, as we read things, as we experience them. So that is American Prophets. That's what this exhibit is about. That's why we think it's important. And if any of you all have any questions, I would be happy to take them. Yeah. I think someone's going to come over with a mic for the folks on YouTube, because otherwise they won't hear your question. Everybody hear me okay? Good.
Is this working? Yes.
When does the exhibit leave?
The exhibit will be up at least until the end of this year. So you have time to come see it. There will be lots of programming, but come anytime. We'd love to see you. Other questions?
Your exhibit contains such a wealth of information, and it's so far-reaching. I'd be interested in knowing how long it took you as a group to prepare this. And then also just one question, will you be hosting another indoor golf tournament?
You came to one of my Get Lits. We have not done that again because the indoor putting arrangement was a lot of work. Not as much work as this exhibit, but it was a lot of work on my very small staff. That was my idea, and that was one of those where it's like, all right, let's humor the boss, and let's spend 6 hours setting up an indoor putting arrangement. But it was a lot of fun, and we did have a blast. But as far as the exhibit, 2.5 years. So we started the process of imagining what this would be and applying for a planning grant in 2023. We had the planning grant in 2024, and we were working on this for about 2.5 years.
I've seen the exhibit as well as some of the many author talks, and I have found all of them to be interesting and thought-provoking. You've been
Thanks.
working on this so long. When you step back, personally, if you are willing to talk about this, and take a wide view of the religious influences in the United States over the years, do you see a trend as to where we were, where we are, and where we're going? So in a nutshell, can you predict the future?
I cannot. I am not the expert. That's why we bring in experts. I will tell you that spending a lot of time on this opens up some different veins of thought. You know, that idea of how many people see something as spiritual. You know, that same Pew Research study that came out most recently, the late 24, or came out in 24, and it was very much focused on this idea that there had been somewhat of a plateauing of the dropping that had been going on for years, that at least it seemed like it had settled. But it also recognized generationally that there was a much larger, older audience in that Christian belief area and a much younger audience in the non-belief. And the shift from non-belief to belief is not as big as people might hope that it is. So there is a notion that as we age as a population that we may continue to see drops in how people associate with religions and what religions. I will tell you anecdotally, I work with a lot of young people. I'm the old man on the staff. And one of the things that I've seen from my own kids, from young people that I work with, and one of the young folks, I think there is a constant desire for ideas that people can find structure around. And I will anecdotally say that the rise in interest in young people about horoscopes and astrology, you can say whatever you will about it, does show a desire for understanding. Even if they say it's a joke, but if they spend as much time as they do understanding things, you know, when I was a kid, we all knew what our sign was, right? I knew I was a Cancer. That was it. It didn't mean anything to me, you know, but you had to tell everyone what you were. Then it has now become that there are much more detailed understandings of, you know, what moon, what this, what that. It is a much more detailed piece of understanding. One of the writers in the exhibit that we feature is a science fiction writer. She's deceased. She wrote comic books and science fiction, and was a very interesting writer because she also was Jewish and maintained her Jewish faith her whole life, but was also very interested in spirituality and mysticism, and became a tarot reader of some renown, to the point at which she wrote a book about how to write the tarot and created her own deck. And her widow gave us a statue of Persephone, the goddess, that she found very important, along with her Shabbat candles. So I think that what you see is people looking for ways to better understand each other, ways to better understand their place in the universe and their beliefs, and maybe struggling with where to find those answers. So I would say, looking at the data, that we may see more drops, but I think that we may also see rise and creation of new belief systems that might be the merging of other belief systems where people are trying to find understanding and find the things that hold them together. And I think that, you know, one of the things, obviously, people ask me, well, is Dianetics in here? And yes, it is. It's in the science fiction section that we talk about L. Ron Hubbard. But, you know, you're talking about millions of people finding belief and happiness through a particular channel. You know, the Mormon faith was founded here in America. So there are things that I think will continue to be created to help fill that.
Anyone else?
This may be a little bit off topic, but I'm wondering, what is the intersection between creative writing and AI? Because I read an article last year about a writer who saw something that AI wrote mimicking him,
Yeah.
And people couldn't tell it apart from his own writing.
Yeah, it's the writing community, the American writers around the world are very upset about the rise of artificial intelligence, not just because of the notion of what it can create or how people might utilize it, but mostly how it's been created. It's been created by taking the works of people, illegally copyrighted work, and then creating algorithms that can take that language and that style of writing and create new writing based upon a prompt. But that's because their original work has been taken and used by the machine to teach the machine with no reward given to the writer, no recognition given to the writer. So the problem is, and there have been lawsuits brought by writers and writers groups already against the AI companies. And there have been some legal findings against them that are in favor of the writers, but it's going to be a long struggle for many of them. Scott Turow spoke at our gala this year and specifically spoke about that topic and the court cases that he has been involved in to try and push that forward. I think from a learning perspective, there is a huge amount of danger as to how quickly our educational institutions adapt to this, how we teach students to write, and the importance of teaching students to write. You know, one of the things I usually talk about when we talk about why education is so important, why it's so important to teach young people to write, is that when you make someone an author, you give them authority. You give them the ability to write their own narrative. Frederick Douglass is the perfect example of someone who gained power when he was able to teach himself to read and to write. And through that power was able to tell his own narrative, tell his own story, change his existence. So writing is the path through which we give people power for themselves. And so it is incredibly important. And if they give up that power to a machine to do it for them, they will lose the critical thinking skills involved in that process. And so our school systems need to find ways to ensure that students are writing original work. And whether that means going back to blue books and pen and paper. We have manual typewriters in our museum, if you have not visited. They're there for anybody to use, and the kids love them. You know, the kids go nuts during the field trips. They want to be all over them. I have a staff member there the whole time a field trip is in the room. And one of the kids once described the typewriter as an instant printer. Because they've only ever sent their work to be printed somewhere. They've never seen it come out that way. So the tactile nature of writing is incredibly important. And so I think we have to find ways to maintain that tactile connection to writing. I'm not saying that AI is going away. I'm not saying that it can't be a benefit to society, but how we embrace technologies and how we handle their integration into our daily lives and our educational systems are things that, as a society, we need to take time with. So does that answer your question a little bit? Sure.
Somebody else? I have a question. This is the American Writers Museum. Is there a German Writers Museum, or have you all looked at other countries? Because we're a big and diverse country, huge population, but there must be a counterpart in someplace else.
In other places there is actually a German one. The story of this museum, I'll give you the brief overview. Our founder is a guy named Malcolm O'Hagan. Malcolm O'Hagan, he's not a writer. He's not a museum person. He's an Irish immigrant. Came to the U.S. for graduate school, met his wife, never left. Was a mechanical, or, oh God, I'm going to say that wrong. He was an electrical engineer. And he took over an organization called the National Electrical Manufacturers Association. Sounds like a museum guy, right? Ran this national association for most of his career, retired, but he's Irish, and Irish love literature. And he grew up loving poetry, loving literature. He goes home to Ireland for visits. He goes all the time. And he's home, this is a number of years ago, and he goes to a place called the Dublin Writers Museum, which actually doesn't exist anymore. But they do have a new museum called the Molly. And if you ever get a chance, go to the Molly in Dublin. But he went, he came back. In his retirement, he'd been a docent at the Library of Congress, giving tours. and he's, you know, showing people around, kids around, kid groups. He loves it, and he's having fun. But he starts asking people at the Library of Congress, "Is there a National Writers Museum of any kind?" And they go, "No." And he goes, "Well, there should be." And he just took it on himself. Talks to a couple of his neighbors, talks to his book club. Wife, or one of the book club members, talks to her husband. He's a German lawyer from Mayor Brown, and he says, I agree with you. We should get this done. His other neighbor, Jay Hammer, steps up. So these three just take it on themselves. They're going to figure it out. They have no idea what they're doing. They haven't opened a museum in their lives. They haven't, they're not necessarily literary figures who've studied literature or anything like that. They just think it's important. So that kind of notion I mentioned that, we had all these advisors, we had all these different things. It came from that idea of let's get everybody together, or let's, get everybody together, find a barn and put on a show. If you all remember our Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland movies. And that's what they did. Malcolm knocked on the door of the NEH, or the NEA, and demanded to be heard. Stood in the lobby. I'm not kidding you. Until one of the associate directors came down, who was in charge of the literary side of the NEA, and sat with him and said, "I'll give you 15 minutes." And 45 minutes later, he said, "Okay, I'm sold. But we can't help you." So he sent him over to the NEH. He somehow got to the head of the NEH. He somehow got a $30,000 planning grant. Went back the next year, got another one. Went back the third year, and the staff told the president to stop letting him have planning grants. But he got advice from the Smithsonian, and they led him to a museum design firm. And so it was very much a process of love and desire to see American writing celebrated the way it should be. Is there one of these in every country? No. In various countries, yes. In Ireland, yes. In Germany, yes. And so that was a lot of the impetus for why we should have this.
So when was it founded?
They started working on it in 2010 and we opened in May of 2017. I was hired in sometime in 2016. They went around the country. I see Francie in the back. They went around the country and held charrettes. Francie Harrington's in the back, if you know Francie Harrington, and she was in some of those groups. They went from city to city and held these charrettes, and she was in one of the Chicago charrettes, or two of them, I think they held here. And they were doing two things. They were getting a lot of feedback, led by the museum designer, Andy Anway, on what should be in a writer's museum, what should it be about. They would meet with scholars and writers and other people in these towns. And they went to New York, they went to Chicago, they went to San Francisco, I forget where else they went, maybe Denver. But in that, they were also examining the cities as potentials. They didn't think DC was the right place for it, even though they were all from DC. Well, maybe that's why. And so they thought Chicago was the center of the country. They felt that there was enough philanthropic support from people they met that they could put it together here and help sustain it and make it live here. And they felt that Chicago had its own rich literary tradition that made sense as a place to have a museum of this sort. So that's how Chicago was chosen.
All right. Well, that's the time we have for our class today, and I want to thank Mr. Cranston for an enlightening and engaging tour through the museum and the American prophets.